Okay, today we're going to look at the timeline for the Poor Law and kind of go through all the key features, everything that we cover in the course, and just add on a few extra notes here and there. Now, it's up to you if you want to have as detailed or maybe less notes, but to do this based on whatever you're comfortable with. So we're going to start at the top with the Elizabethan Poor Law. And although this is 200 years before our kind of topic, they are still using it for the Poor Law. And so with this, we have all 15,000 parishes suddenly become responsible for the orphans, the old and the sick. And this is not because they're necessarily caring. They actually did think that the paupers would be an issue for them. They thought they were the ones causing all the crime. But it does give a little bit of responsibility to make sure those most vulnerable people are looked after. Now, we also have 1662, which are the laws of settlement. And this, therefore, is designed to stop people moving around. Now, the point of this one is very much to make sure that parishes are responsible just for their own people, so that you're not getting overburdened by having lots of people moving here and there. The Gilbert's Act is one of our first workhouse acts, and it is a workhouse, but this is a refuge. This is in comparison to the slightly earlier 1722 Knactable Act, which is a workhouse act, but this is very much a deterrent. They wanted to make sure less people were there, and they are the ones encouraging the building of workhouses. This one is slightly more nice because it's therefore a refuge, and they also allow parishes to group so that the cost was split. And we're going to see that almost reflected later on with the Poor Law Amendment Act. Now, as well as this, one of the earliest issues we have with the Poor Law is the Spieneland system. And although it's never a law, it is very, very popular. And this is like allowances and kind of subsidies to kind of top up the wages. It is massively opposed, though, so that is a huge thing we need to kind of put in. It's widely opposed because a lot of people argued that it lowered the wages and made things worse. Okay. Also, a lot of poor people had more children because it was based on the number of children you had. Now, after this point, we start to see acts being taken more in our time period, so stuff that actually is going to get done. Now, in 1817, we see the government pass the Poor Employment Act in 1817, which made public money available to employ able-bodied paupers. So it's an attempt to kind of get people working, but it doesn't really come to anything. Now, they already know that they've got some of these problems, and so in 1818, we start to see them start to formalise the whole Poor Law Amendment kind of things. They're starting to figure out about how to formalise poor relief and how people get it. And this kind of act allowed the creation of parish committees, and they are the ones that get to decide the relief. So rather it being like a bigger responsibility from the government, actually they're kind of giving the ownership back to these private individuals. However, the only problem with this is that the committees are elected by the ratepayers. So they're not necessarily going to be thinking of the poor's best interest. Now, with this, we also have the 1819 Act to amend the laws for poor relief. So again, we're kind of starting to get things giving control. So both of these help to cause this creation. Now, it kind of finishes there, and we don't really have a lot going on because all that happens is that we have continual rising costs, we have continual failures, and these lead to things like the swing riots. Now, although the swing riots are mostly about wages being reduced, which we knew from our industrialisation topic, it is interesting to note that most of the counties with the Spieneland system are the ones that revolt. So I'm going to put mostly counties with Spieneland system. So although it's not necessarily about the poor laws, it is interesting that the Spieneland system is clearly causing these issues. It's making employers put lower wages, which in turn is causing part of the swing riots. Now, in 1832, we have the Royal Commission. The Royal Commission, remember, is just a committee which is established to figure out what's going on. And this is ran by Edwin Chadwick and a man we haven't really touched upon, who is called Nassau Senior. And with these, they basically start to send out questionnaires. Sorry, my handwriting is so horrible at the bottom here. I can't control the page and my phone. And out of the 15,000 parishes, they only got a 10% response. And there's a lot of criticism to this because there is argument to suggest that the questions themselves were very much too complicated for poor people to understand. They argued that actually Edwin Chadwick and Nassau Senior had started writing the whole kind of report for the commission even before they got the questionnaires back. So there's a lot of controversy about this. We already know that Edwin Chadwick is of the utilitarianism argument, and so it is not a fair Royal Commission if we're thinking about actually what they're looking at. Now, this Royal Commission then established the Poor Law Amendment Act, which is kind of the biggest feature in this whole timeline, because not a lot actually progresses, not a lot actually happens, but this is the big change in legislation. This is the big one that they decided to do. And with this, we can see here, the Spieneland system is abolished. We have the removal of outdoor relief completely. And instead, we're looking at workhouses and things like that. The other good thing about this was they did create a central board. And the idea behind this was that they were going to try and standardise things, try and make things a bit better. But as we're going to see, it doesn't really make much difference. Now, with the 1834, they obviously get rid of all the outdoor relief and they start building more workhouses. So, for instance, 1836, Andover House was built. Now, this is the kind of pinnacle. This is the very much example of a deterrent workhouse. Mostly they are working 10-hour days. We have low kind of food quantity, so they're kind of starvation rations. And this one in particular, Andover, was very much known for kind of penny pinching and really not having many costs at all. Now, this is going to lead to the Andover scandal. And this Andover scandal is huge. The poor people are in such cruelty that actually we find that 61 paupers start to go to prison deliberately. So they purposely steal so they can go to prison, which is actually better conditions. So 61 paupers purposely committed crimes. And there was all sorts of issues here. There was sexual abuse, there was starvation, there was all manner of issues. And so this suddenly became highlighted. So I'm going to put here, especially well published by critics, and the Times is a really good example of this. Now, there's a lot of ideas to suggest that this marks one of the major changes in approaches, but there are other factors as well. So it's up to you how much of an impact you think the Andover scandal had. Now, just before this, we have some of these other factors. So, for instance, Thomas Carlyle. Now, Thomas Carlyle is one of the individuals who starts to campaign for almost like better conditions and starting to make the awareness known. And we start to see in this period a lot more of these individuals coming in. Now, the good thing about Thomas Carlyle's work, which is talking about poor law prisons, is that it was well read by middle class reformers. So he very much has these people on his side. Whereas actually, when we look at, say, Charles Dickens and people like that, that's almost the kind of working class more on their side than the middle class. But there is a kind of lots of different people, all different walks of life that are getting influenced. And we are not forgetting the women. We finally have a woman in here that is getting involved. And Elizabeth Gaskell, she again, a bit like Charles Dickens, does her fictional stories, her novels, but it gave a realistic impression of Manchester for this one. And the good thing about these novels is they are not opposed. So if it was like a poor law, anti-poor law magazine or an anti-poor law poster, they're very much opposed by the government. But because it's a novel, because it's fiction technically, it's not opposed, and so that gives it a lot more traction. That's why people like Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell start to kind of gain in that popularity. Now, we also have the Poor Law Commission being abolished in 1847, so it's not lasted very long in this sense, with this idea of kind of a more of a central unit. And this actually starts to shift things, because actually, whereas all this has been kind of controlled by the parishes and individuals, this is now giving government more control again. And I think potentially this is partly due to the Andover scandal that that we have this kind of move towards it. So this could be where we consider a shift in opinion. But obviously, this is 1847. We've already had Thomas Carlyle in 1843. We've got Elizabeth Gaskell not far behind. Then we get Henry Mayhew. Henry Mayhew is a little bit different to the others, and that's because he makes what we call an empirical work. And it's huge. He has a 4-volume work detailing all of these things. And we kind of consider this the first study by an individual in particular. It's a little bit like... he's gone to research this. This is proper scientific beyond the other style. And it has great detail, and it kind of finds that wages are insufficient. Not people being lazy, not people being dependent. It is that wages are insufficient, and that is what's causing many of these problems. Now, all these people you would think would have quite an impact, but actually one of the biggest impacts is from a man called Samuel Smiles. And Samuel Smiles is a social reformer, and he believed in this idea of self-help, that actually we need to give people the tools to help themselves and then they'll work. And this was very much loved by the middle class, who were already self-made men. And so his theory of self-help starts to become more important and starts gaining traction, to the point that he sells 250,000 copies of this book. And this kind of provides the answers to all these issues and awareness. He, again, provides the answers that charities and people can use as a framework. Now, other than the individuals, we've also got some other things going on. So, for instance, 1852, the outdoor relief regulations. So, although this said you can't have any outdoor relief, they're now saying you can have outdoor relief. And so instead, they're trying to make it more uniform. And they're also saying that you can replace your workhouse with outdoor relief. And part of this is probably due to the costs, probably due to the scandals. So it actually works out better for the parishes to do this rather than have the workhouses, which kind of defeats the whole point of the Poor Law Amendment Act. But there we go. We also have a bit more refinement with the workhouses, with the Workhouse Visiting Society, which are officially unofficial checks, a bit like Ofsted. They're kind of keeping an eye on it. So workhouses should become better, but there is the option to do the outdoor relief too. Now, from all of these different things, from the individuals up here, from the slight changes in legislation, we can see more legislation changing. So we have, for instance, the Metropolitan Poor Act is passed, requiring separate medical facilities for workhouses. And this also provided, if I can move my page, also provided the creation of the Metropolitan Asylum. I'll just put Met Asylum, which is very much looking after sick paupers. So they took that responsibility away. So again, we've got medical facilities now, we've got separate care for the sick. It's improving. It's definitely improving. And then also in 1869, we have the Charity Organisation Society. It's not as amazing as you think to start with. It's still quite deserving versus undeserving. And it was actually, I'm going to put born out of a fear of dependence. It very much thought that charity was just going to give more dependence on the poor. So it tried to be more objective. So to be more objective, and it only granted assistance after reviewing the case. Eventually, it did become more constructive and it did become much more thoughtful, but that kind of happened a little bit later on in time. Now, this is kind of the end of the poor provision. We've seen massive horrendous conditions and kind of it not working, it's way too much money, and that leads to the Poor Law Amendment Act. However, the Poor Law Amendment Act doesn't work because we have workhouses which are horrible and they're deterrents, and then we have the scandals. And then from this point, we start to see an attitude changing. So we start to see much more awareness of the conditions through a lot of these books. And we've also got this theory of self-help, which a lot of people started to turn towards, a little bit like the ideological pressures before. This one they very much turn to. And in the meantime, we have a lot of legislation that starts to undermine this. So starting to bring back outdoor relief, starting to improve workhouse commissions, starting to bring in requiring separate facilities, and so on and so forth. And in the end, charity kind of wins the day because we have the Charity Organisation Society established. Unlike all of the other topics that we've done where we've seen a kind of projection straight up, this doesn't have that. All right, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, and it doesn't really get anywhere. And that's why the Poor Law Amendment Act is such a controversial thing, because it doesn't help the poor. It's actually worse. Now, combining that with everything else we've looked at, with all the other struggles, this is one of the ones that they just don't really achieve.